All. Hope everyone's having a good day. We're on Parshas Ki Teitzei, which is found again in the Blue Ox Chumash on page 1046. In the Blue Ox Chumash, if not, it's chapter 21, Deuteronomy, verse 10. Just give me 1 second here. Hi, Marvin. It's good to see you in New York. How are you? Shalom, shalom. Glad you're joining us. Hold 1 second, please. Okay, we're ready to begin. You're going to be happy to hear this. This week's Torah portion is very special because it has more commandments in this week's Torah portion than any other Torah portion in the entire Torah. We all know there are 613 commandments. 248 of them are positive commandments. 365 are what we call negative commandments. Thou shalt not do this or not do that. And of course, they don't all apply to every single Jew. Some only apply to Kohanim, some only apply to men, some only apply to women. Some only apply if you live in the land of Israel, like the sabbatical year, this coming year, which is just a few weeks away, is going to be a Shemitah, sabbatical year. So if you live in Israel, there are many laws about the produce, what you may or may not eat, that do not apply to Jews living in Palm Beach unless they're buying fruit from Israel. But in grand total, there's 613 commandments. Now, since there are 53 Torah portions, you would expect that the average Torah portion would have about 12 commandments if you do the average. But there are some portions in Genesis that are just stories with 0 commandments. And then you have this week's Torah portion, Ki Teitzei, which has 74 commandments. 74 out of 613, which I'm not a mathematician, but it sounds like 8 or 9% of all the commandments are in one single Torah portion. So obviously there's a lot to discuss and we can't get to everything, but let's try to dwell on a few points. The Torah portion begins with the laws of war, but we're going to go to the second commandment in this week's Torah portion because I think it's very practical and very relevant to us. And that is the laws of inheritance. Now, inheritance, of course, is something very practical because everyone has to deal with that at some point, whether transferring their assets to their children or receiving from their parents. And someone says it's timely now. Do you want to explain, Amy, why you say it's timely now? But while we wait for Amy to explain why it's timely now, I will say the following. Coming here from Brooklyn to Palm Beach, I've had a lot of experiences. And one of the experiences I've had here is I've been involved in family situations. And the truth is, you just have to look back in the Torah and see how many problems occurred because of inheritance issues. But I have to just tell you that it's been unfortunate to see situations where I knew the parents, wonderful people, they worked hard to give their children the best possible life. But after their passing, when you see the infighting amongst the siblings over the inheritance of the parents, it's truly, truly heartbreaking because I knew the parents and thinking, all they wanted was their kids to love each other. And if they knew that all of their wealth that they accumulated, all of their hard work would not be a gift to their children, but God forbid, unfortunately, lead to dissolving of the relationship between siblings, it would be so heartbreaking to them. And, would the parents even want to have accumulated all that wealth if it would result in sibling rivalry over inheritance? And it's one of the saddest things I've experienced. But the truth is, it goes back to biblical times. It's nothing new. All you have to do is go back to the stories of the Torah, and we see all the sibling rivalries over what we call favoritism. One child receives a larger portion than the other child, or was considered favored by a parent, or whatever the circumstances may have been. I could tell you stories. I could spend the whole hour telling you personal anecdotes without names, obviously, but I've seen so many circumstances. One circumstance I saw was where a parent was upset at a certain child and left the child out of the will. And the other child was such a good child, they came to me and they said, Rabbi, I have a question. This is the situation, but I fear that my brother will never talk to me again if I follow the rules of my parents' will. On the other hand, I don't want to be disrespectful to my father's wishes. He didn't want this son to inherit for whatever reason. He was upset at the son. And so he asked me, I want to give 50% to my brother because I want to be on good terms with my brother and his wife and his children. I don't want a rift in the family. On the other hand, do I have to obey my father's wishes? Because he clearly didn't want this child to receive anything for whatever reason that may have been. So he was torn between honoring his father's wishes, but at the same time, wanting to make a voluntary gift to his brother just to keep peace in the family. So, like I said, it's truly a painful subject. But this week's Torah portion addresses it head on. And we're going to jump right into it. It's verse 15. I just want to see Amy's comments because I love feedback. Oh, timely, I guess, for you. Okay. I thought maybe there's something going on that's timely for everyone. But either way, here's what the Torah says. The Torah tells the following scenario. Torah says a man, and this is where it gets more complicated because we know today there's a lot of situations with divorce. So someone could have children from multiple marriages. And that only makes it more complicated, obviously, right? But here's what the Torah says in those days. In those days, a person was allowed to marry. It was customary then for people to marry more than one wife. So a man marries two wives. And here's the way the Torah phrases it. The Torah says, one he loves, and to be very frank, the Torah says, va'achat snua, and the other one is the hated one. Now, I know that's very jarring. How could a man hate his wife? Well, you could say, well, it happens sometimes. But the truth is, a lot of the commentaries say it doesn't literally mean he hated her. What happens is, if you go back to the story of Jacob, Rachel, and Leah, it says he loved Rachel. And Leah was the hated wife. And many of the commentaries interpret it to mean that she felt hated or she felt unloved. In other words, being in a marriage with another woman, Rachel, and we all know how that happened. That was never Jacob's intention to marry both. He wanted to marry Rachel, but it was Laban who tricked him into marrying the older daughter. And now he was stuck with two wives. And because Leah knew that Jacob didn't really have any feelings for her, he was only interested in Rachel. Alongside Jacob's display of love for Rachel, Leah felt hated. She felt despised. She felt unloved. And that was a very painful source in her life. We know that when she named her kids, she said, Reuven, Hashem saw my plight and gave me a child because maybe now my husband will love me. And then Shimon, God heard my plight. And Levi, now my husband will attach himself to me. The word Levi means attachment. And Judah, each one, she's yearning for her husband's love. This was a terrible void and emptiness and a pain in her life because she felt despised. And, love is not something that you set out to love one spouse more than another in those days. Or today, you don't set out to love one child more than another. Love happens, as they say. You grow feelings. So your natural emotional development could lead you to love one child more than another. And the Torah warns us time and again not to do that because we see the grave consequences of that. Jacob had more love for Rachel over Leah. Hence, he had more love for Joseph over the other brothers. Hence, the brothers threw him in a pit and sold him into slavery. Hence, the Jewish people were exiled in Egyptian slavery. And the Rabbi said, look how much trouble, misfortune, heartache, pain, suffering in the family came about because of the extra love that Jacob had for one wife over another, one child over another. And therefore, rabbis say never have more love for one child than another child, because the detriment and the negative outcome and consequences will only lead to misfortune. And we learn from our history not to do that, to love all of our children equally and never display additional love or affection for one child or another, as Jacob made a coat of many colors for Joseph that he didn't make for the other brothers, which only irritated, frustrated, angered, and caused the brothers to hate Joseph. So as the parent, you may think you're helping that child or giving that child extra love, but you're actually causing the siblings to resent that child. And therefore, you're not helping that child, you're hurting that child. But going back to this week's Torah portion, the Torah says a man has two wives, one he loves, one he hates, or one is the unloved wife. But here's what happens. Verse 15 says, the older child, the firstborn, is the son of the woman he does not love, the unloved wife. So therefore, this father has a dilemma now, because according to the laws of the inheritance, the oldest child gets a double inheritance. Now, this is something that we know that, at least in biblical times, the oldest child inherited, meaning the oldest child, the kings of Israel, for example. It's also today true in Hasidic dynasties. If a Rebbe has many children, the oldest child usually succeeds the Rebbe. The oldest child, right, is the one who is the continuity takes the seat of the position of the father. Now, there are exceptions to that rule, and we see that in the biblical times as well. Reuven was the oldest child of Jacob, but on his deathbed, Jacob says, Reuven, you have proven yourself unworthy of being the leader of the brothers. And so Judah becomes the father of all the kings of Israel, not Reuven. And there are many other examples of the firstborn being passed over, but it always led to a rift and a struggle. So even take the story of Abraham. He has Isaac and Ishmael, but he chooses Isaac over Ishmael. And that rift is still going on till today between the Arabs and the Jews. And then Jacob and Esau, we know that the mother Rivka favored Jacob. The father Isaac favored Esau because he felt he was the oldest son. He couldn't pass him up. And we all know what happened when it was time to give the blessings and he disguised them and so on and so forth. But the Torah says the oldest child deserves a second double inheritance. And there's a reason for it. The reason is because when you're a parent, your oldest child assumes responsibilities for the other children. They are the eldest child, and therefore they bear certain roles of responsibility of caring for their siblings, but most of all, being role models for their younger siblings. And therefore, because they carry and shoulder some of the responsibilities of being the oldest child and helping the parents with the other children, not just physically, but also spiritually, emotionally, and so on and so forth, therefore they receive a double inheritance. But here the Torah says, what's if the man, his oldest child is from the woman he despises or doesn't love, and the woman he loves gives him his second child, and now he wants to give the double inheritance, or at least not give a double inheritance to the oldest child because I don't love that child from the mother that I hate. I want a double inheritance, or at least equal inheritance, to go to the child of the woman I love. Now again, today we only have one wife, but today you could say the same thing with divorce. Someone had a bitter divorce, they're upset at their first wife, whatever it is, and they don't want to give the double inheritance or whatever it is. They don't want to give any inheritance. They want to give a small inheritance. They want to give it to the woman, the child of the woman they love, let's say, right? But basically what the Torah says is justice must prevail over love. Your emotions are your emotions, and you should try to control your emotions and love all your children. But at the end of the day, even if you love one child over another, you must do what is just. And therefore the Torah says when it comes time to give your inheritance to your children, lo yuchal levaker et ben ova al pnei ben hasnua habachor. You cannot give the right of the firstborn to the son of the beloved one ahead of the son of the hated one, the firstborn. You must abide by the laws of justice. That is the opening, the second opening commandment of this week's Torah portion. We have an expression in English that says love conquers all. And of course, love is the most powerful emotion. And we're supposed to love Hashem. We're supposed to love our neighbor as ourselves. Love is very dominant in Judaism. V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha, you should love the Lord your God. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, v'ahavta et hager, you should love the stranger in your midst. Many commandments that deal with love. But when you go back to Avram Avinu and Hashem says, why did I choose Abraham? God says, the reason I'm choosing you, Abraham, is Lamana sheyitzaveh et banav et beito achrav lachtzos tzedakah u'mishpat. I am choosing Abraham because he will do righteous justice. And we've talked about what righteous justice means versus plain justice. Righteous justice means compassionate, merciful justice, not just cold justice. And therefore, what God is saying to Abraham is, he doesn't say I chose Abraham because he loves me more than everyone else. Love is very important, but it doesn't conquer all. Love without justice is a very limited form of love. So, and when we say that, it as you see in this story, it doesn't even mean necessarily that you don't love someone else. It means that you show extra favoritism, extra love to one party over another, but that's not just, that's not fair. And therefore, we can't just follow our emotions and our love. We also have to do what is right, what is just, and therefore you should not favor or give disproportionate inheritance to one child over another. You should do what is just, what is fair, what is correct, because as the Torah shows us time and again, and that's what the whole book of Genesis is about. If there's a running theme throughout the book of Bereshit, it's about sibling rivalry and jealousy. You start with Cain and Abel. Cain murders Abel out of jealousy. Then you have the conflict between Isaac and Ishmael. Then you have Jacob and Esau. Then you have Joseph and the brothers. It's literally the story. You have the rivalry between the two wives, Rachel and Leah. So time and again, when one sibling is elevated over the other, that only leads to troubles. And therefore, here the Torah puts it in a law form and saying that you, despite what your feelings may be for one child over another, when it comes to the laws of an inheritance, you have to do what is just, what is fair, and you cannot elevate the child that you love above the child that you don't love. That is a very powerful lesson about the limits of love, that even love, which we always think is the most beautiful, virtuous thing in the world, which it truly is. We should live our lives full of love, of family, of Hashem, of our fellow man. It's the most important ingredient. It's the first of all the emotional attributes. But there's sometimes that love, believe it or not, has to have a limit. Because too much love, misdirected or guided towards one person over another, even though you may say, well, it's love. I feel the way I feel. People always, everything in the name of love. I love this child more. What should I do? And the answer is yes. Sometimes you have to curtail your love, because when you show more love to one child over another, the other child is being hurt by that. And you may say, well, I'm not doing anything bad or contrary or negative to that other child, but just when that child sees the additional love displayed towards that other child, like Joseph and the brothers, or Rachel and Leah, that's going to make that child feel as though they are not loved, as they are unloved. And therefore, one has to be very careful when it comes to these matters. Now, continuing, this week's Torah portion has so many things. I'm going to pick and choose because there's 74 commandments. I'm not going to go in order, but I'm going to jump around a little bit and want to go to the next page, which is 1048 in the Blue Art Scroll Chumash, chapter 22. And I love this commandment because of its simplicity. And then we're going to end the sequence of this commandment. It's chapter 22, verse 1. I love when the Torah shows us values that run contrary to common thought and wisdom today. So every child in kindergarten learns this rhyme somehow. Finders keepers, losers weepers. Whoever came up with that idiotic rhyme and why it's perpetuated from generation to generation, that everyone knows it, is beyond my understanding. But here the Torah tells us just the opposite. The Torah says, do not turn a blind eye. If you see the ox of your neighbor, the sheep of your neighbor going astray, you see an animal going astray, do not turn a blind eye to it. Do not ignore it, but rather return it to its rightful owner, to your brother. And what's if I don't know whose it is? Guess what, says the Torah? You have to take this animal. Now, we're not talking about an item like a watch. You found the watch, you put it on the shelf until you find the owner. This is an animal. You got to feed it. You got to take care of it. Torah says, take the animal into your home and hold on to it and take care of it until you find its owner and you return it to him. This is called the mitzvah of Hashavat Avedah, returning lost objects. And so says the Torah should do for his donkey or for his garment or for any lost article of your brother that may become lost from him and you find it, you shall not hide yourself. Now what the Torah is saying is, you may say, I'm too busy, I didn't notice this animal going astray, pretend you didn't see anything. No. If you see it, you become obligated to return it to its rightful owner, even if it means, now there's a whole section in the Talmud. It's the first section of Baba Metzia. I'm sorry, it's not the first section. It's called Elo Metzias. These are the objects, all the laws, what you do when you find it, how you find the rightful owner, how they have to prove it, what length of time you have to look for the owner, what happens with the expenses and all of that. Whole section in the Talmud. Every yeshiva boy who goes to 5th grade knows Elu Metzias. It's one of the first sections of Talmud that Jewish boys learn in yeshiva. And it's all predicated on these few verses about lost objects. So on the one hand, it's common sense. You know, if you lost something, you would want someone to return it to you. So if you find something, you should try to find the rightful owner. And this is part of being a good neighbor. If you love your neighbor as yourself, you try to return their lost object to them. And this is what we would call today social capital, right? You want to live in a society where you know that people are looking out for one another, that people care about each other. There was a story in the news last week that caught my attention. I don't remember the details, but the story was there was a black real estate agent who was looking at a home that he was going to sell. And a neighbor looked in and saw a black real estate agent, but he didn't know it was the real estate agent. He thought that it was a burglar breaking in. And he called the police, and the police came and put handcuffs on the person. And then they realized he's just a real estate agent. And it became a whole racial story. The racial story was, if he wasn't black, he would not have called the police on him. Because he was black, he assumed he was a thief. Now I have to tell you something. Why did this story ring a bell with me? Because I once had a similar story, believe it or not. What happened was I had a contractor doing some work on my house, and I was out of town. This was in Palm Beach, in my old house. And my brother came to town and needed a place to stay. So I said, go stay in my house. I'm not there. So he was staying in the house. But he didn't know. I forgot to tell him that there's a contractor who's doing some work in my house. So my brother wakes up one morning and he hears somebody opening up the door to the house. He thought it was a burglar breaking into the house. So he called 911. The police of Palm Beach came and they see this guy in my house and they literally put handcuffs on him. They thought he was a burglar. And then he said, I'm the contractor. I have a key. Rabbi Scheiner let me in. And they called me and they verified. But the poor guy was traumatized. I felt terrible. It was my fault because I didn't tell my brother that there's a guy coming. I forgot that I had given this guy the key to do some work in my house. So it doesn't matter if the person's black or white. Someone sees somebody in someone else's house, they could be suspicious. But there was a lot of commentary on the news whether this was racism because he was a black real estate person and so on and so forth. But one of the notes I noticed on the article, someone commented, someone said, well, who would want to move into such a neighborhood? Like, this house is for sale, but who would buy a house where there's racists living next door? And then someone else commented and said, I would actually want to live in that house, because that means it's a neighborhood where neighbors care about each other's homes. Someone saw somebody in someone else's home that they didn't recognize, they called the police. In other words, a lot of times in communities, we see this all the time, people turn a blind eye. There's been horrible stories of people who were attacked in the streets, and nobody said a word, nobody did anything. Or somebody was hit by a car and people just drove around them and let him lay on the floor. You want to live in a community, in a society where love your neighbor as yourself is literal. When you see someone in need, you go out of your way to help them. There's nothing more beautiful than lending a helping hand to somebody in need. You see somebody having a problem, a struggle. It could be as simple as seeing a person elderly person carrying their bags, and you offer to help them, right? Or holding a door for somebody. These little gestures show that we actually care about one another. And that creates social capital where we have trust and good feelings, right? Anytime you think of someone who did a kindness for you, you feel good about it. Oh, wow, I remember the time this person came and helped me, lent a hand, offered me a ride, offered me some assistance. That becomes like the highlight of the experience. Someone came to shul this morning. I'll give you an example. We had a minyan this morning, 8 o'clock. And this Hasidic Jew was visiting in town. He's staying in one of the local hotels. He's in town for a day. He came to shul, right? And he was so impressed. The beautiful shul in Palm Beach with a minyan. He's a chassid with a long black coat and a big white beard from Borough Park. He'd never been to a place like Palm Beach. He didn't see such a community. He was very happy. But then he said, where could I eat breakfast? We told him there's no kosher restaurants in Palm Beach. So he was like, oh, I don't know what I'm going to do. So one of our members, Moshe Scheiner, said, you know what? There's a Publix on the corner. Come, I'll take you there and I'll show you all the different kosher products you can buy. There's bread from Publix that has a KOU symbol. And that's what happened. He walked him down the street and helped him do some shopping for himself, right? I'm sure that when this guy comes back to Brooklyn, he's going to remember his visit to Palm Beach. He's going to remember that he had a beautiful vacation on the beach. He's going to remember that he had a beautiful shul to daven. But what he's going to remember most is that a stranger in shul walked him to the supermarket to help him find some kosher products. It's those interactions. So the Torah says if someone loses something, you have an obligation. And I'm sure we've all had stories of losing things and people returning it to us and how grateful and appreciative we are. And I'll just tell you, I've told the story before, but there's a quick story about a yeshiva boy who went off the path from Judaism for whatever reason. He was looking for spirituality. He didn't feel Judaism had enough spirituality for him. And he was a seeker. And he ended up in a monastery, some Buddhist monastery. And he was studying Buddhist, they call them Bujus, Buddhist spirituality. And one day he and the other students were walking in the street from the study hall to the dormitories, wherever they were. And someone found something on the street, whatever the item was. The guy bends down, picks it up, and he sort of puts it in his pocket. And this ex-yeshiva boy turns to him and says, what are you going to do with that? He says, what do you mean? I found it. I'm going to keep it. What else do I know? Let's say it was a $20 bill. I don't know. I'm going to keep it, And he said, well, you're not going to try to find the owner? And the guy said something to the effect of, finders, keepers, losers, weepers. Suddenly this boy remembered what he learned in 5th grade, a whole tractate of Talmud, a whole section for days and weeks and months. All they learned about was the laws of lost objects. And then he realized that, what spirituality is? Spirituality is not just meditation. Spirituality is when you find the lost object and you go and try to find the owner and return it. And he realized that Judaism, he was looking for spirituality, but what good is all these spirituality if it doesn't result in practical acts of kindness and goodness? And that brought him back to revisit his Jewish experience and his upbringing and realize the value of such basic laws. But, they say common sense is not common. Yes, there are many stories of people who returned lost objects, but in Judaism, it's a mitzvah, it's an obligation, it's not a voluntary act, it's a commandment, whatever it takes to find the rightful owner. And I'm sure many stories. I could tell you many beautiful, heartwarming stories And the Kiddush Hashem it makes when a Jew shows how honest and ethical and truthful they are, that if they find something, and even if they could keep it because nobody would know, and there was a story in the news, you could look it up after the class, you could Google it. I know Amy always Googles everything and puts it on, so maybe she'll Google it while we learn. But there was a real story in Connecticut, happened maybe 10 years ago, but it went viral, the story. It became a national story. It was on television. A young rabbi in Connecticut, I think it was New Haven, he and his wife had a little apartment, and they went and they needed a little desk. So they went on one of these websites to buy a used desk. And what's the name of these websites that sell used items? I forgot the name, but anyways, type it in, Amy. Anyways, they go on, not eBay. Anyways, people sell used items on this. And Craigslist, there you go. Thank you. They went on Craigslist and they found a little desk for $150. They were going to buy this desk. They went with a truck, they picked it up, they brought it to their house, in their apartment, but the desk was too big. It couldn't fit into the apartment. So he decided to take it apart, to put it in pieces. When he took it apart, in a compartment behind one of the drawers, he found an envelope with cash. He counted the money. You could read the story if you just Google Connecticut rabbi returns $150,000, found $150,000 in cash. Now this is cash, $150,000 that was hidden behind the desk. The rabbi called the woman and said, I found this money in the desk. It's not mine. I want to return it to you. The woman said, I forgot about it, believe it or not. She had inherited money, talk about inheritance, and she had hidden this money for some reason in the desk, and it had been many years and she forgot. And she actually didn't realize. There goes the story from Amy. And he returned the money to this woman. This woman went and told the story to the news outlets because she was so impressed with the honesty of this young rabbi. And this rabbi ended up being interviewed by many, many newspapers, and he was even on television shows about it. But that's the mitzvah of returning a lost object. If it's not yours, you return it. And that's the mitzvah in this week's Parsha. But then the Torah goes to one step further. Now, again, a lot of these commandments are written in biblical times. You have to just update it to modern times. This is one of the most beautiful, again, I hate saying that because who am I to say one mitzvah is more beautiful? But I personally love this commandment. And the commandment says like this: if you see the donkey of your brother or his ox falling on the road, you should not hide yourself from them. Again, don't ignore it. You shall surely stand them up with him. The simple commandment is you're going down the road with your donkey. You see your friend's donkey is collapsing. Your brother's donkey is collapsing, or his ox is. He needs help standing up his fallen donkey with the packages. And you're busy. You got places to go. You want to pretend you didn't see it. You want to ignore it. The Torah says, no, do not hide yourself. Go and help the person. Now, what's the modern day equivalent? Driving down the street and you see someone has a flat tire or their car is overheating. And you're like, okay, let him call AAA. I'm not right now in Brooklyn, believe it or not, there's a whole organization called Chaverim. The word Chaverim means friends. So I'm sure you heard of Hatzalah, where people volunteer to save lives. Believe it or not, there's an organization called Chaverim, which volunteers to go help anyone in need. So literally, if you have a flat tire, you call Chaverim, they come and they fix your flat tire or anything else you need. They're 24/6. It's not life-saving. So it's not like Hatzalah that's 24/7. But 24/6, literally any time of day and night, they have volunteers on hand. If you need help with something, they will come. They're Chaverim, like love your friend as yourself. It's amazing. But here the Torah says, you see this, you have to help that person. You know the old story about this guy. He's driving on the road. He sees a guy with a yarmulke on the side of the road. His car broke down, so he pulls over to help him. As he comes closer to talk to the guy, he sees he has a cross around his neck. He's very confused. So he helps him with his flat tire, and he says, could I ask you, you're wearing a cross and you're wearing a yarmulke. Are you Jewish? He says, no. He says, so why are you wearing a yarmulke? He says, I'll tell you. My mother always told me, keep a yarmulke in the glove compartments. Because if you ever break down, just put on the yarmulke, and within a few minutes, somebody will stop to help you. So when I've got a flat, I put on the yarmulke, and sure enough, it worked. You stopped to help me, right? That's the commandment, to help somebody when their donkey collapses. Now, I want to give you a little bit of a psychological insight that the rabbis give. The last word of the verse says, you shall stand up the donkey with him, imo. What is the emphasis of stand up the donkey with him? So rabbis say, let's say you get to the scene and the Jew says, you have a mitzvah to help me, right? So I'm going to have a seat and you go ahead, help my donkey get up or fix my flat tire. Torah says that's when the mitzvah is over. You no longer have to do it. The mitzvah is only if the person is going to do it with you. Now, why is this so important? Because here the Torah talks about a donkey, and I just applied it to a flat tire. But this really applies to anything. A person is overburdened. If his donkey is overburdened, what's if he's overburdened? What's if he's collapsing from the weight, or she is collapsing from the weight of their burdens in life? They have financial struggles, they have family struggles, they have whatever area of life. Torah says, if you notice, if you see someone's plight, that somebody needs assistance, somebody needs help, somebody needs a lending hand to raise them back up again because they're falling under the weight of the burden of life, you have to raise them up. And you can't say, I have other things to do. If you saw it, if you came to your attention, you're obligated to help. But here's the key word, emo. We all know there's something called an enabler. An enabler is somebody who helps someone else when they're not helping themselves. And then you're not helping them, you're hurting them because you're an enabler. If this person knows you're always going to bail them out of every problem and you're going to come to the rescue, then what motivation do they have to try to help themselves? So the Torah says, if they're willing to do what they can do, but they can't do it themselves, then you have an obligation to do it with them, to help them. But if they're not willing to do anything to help themselves, then not only are you not obligated to help this person, you should not help them because you're not actually helping them, you're hurting them. And this is a dilemma that I know many people have, especially with children, or it could even be with friends or even with spouses maybe, where someone needs your help, but there's something called tough love. Tough love is where it comes a point where you say, I can't help you, because the only way you're going to help them is by not helping them and forcing them to take ownership and responsibility for their lives. And if they show that they're doing their best, I remember there was once a person in the community who needed help, and he was a poor person. He needed psychological help, psychiatric help. So I called this psychiatrist that I know, and I said, could you see this person? He needs he's dealing with some stuff. And he didn't have insurance to pay. So this doctor is a wonderful doctor in the community. He said, I'll be happy to see him. But he stipulated a price, like a very small price. I don't know, like $25 a session. Normally this doctor's $300, $400 an hour. You can't really afford him if you don't have the rent. Yeah, I want $25. And I was like, out of curiosity, I said, like, you're doing it obviously pro bono. Like, why are you asking him for $20 or something? And he made this point. He said, if someone doesn't pay for their own treatment, it's not going to work. They have to be making an investment. They have to be willing to do something for their own benefit to help themselves. And that was the idea, that if a person shows an initiative for their own well-being and to improve their situation, then you must help them. But if they're not doing it with you, it's not emo. You're not doing it with him, but you're doing it instead of him, in place of him. That's never going to work. And therefore, don't even bother. It may even hurt the situation. But I have to tell you something very interesting. There is a second verse, not in this week's Torah portion, that this verse says, if your brother's donkey is collapsing, you should help your brother. But there's a second verse in the Torah that says, what's if you see your enemy's donkey collapsing beneath the weight? And there again, the Torah says, you must help even your enemy. So you're going down the road, you see someone you don't like. The Torah defines the person as your enemy. So nacha. Torah says you must even help your enemy. But here's the amazing thing in the Talmud. The Talmud says, what happens if you're going down the road and there's two sides of the street? On one side of the street, you see your friend's donkey collapsing. On the other side, you see your enemy's donkey collapsing. You could only help one at a time, at least. Who do you go to first? Your friend or your enemy? Now, logically, you would say, go to your friend, the person you love. That person you love could even be maybe your brother, literally, your sister, your relative, your cousin. And the other guy is your enemy. Says the Torah, the law is you must go to your enemy first. And the rabbis say, why your enemy first? And here rabbis say, because it's a double mitzvah. The first mitzvah is you're helping another person in need, another Jew. The second mitzvah is that maybe when your enemy sees that you're willing to help them, maybe there will be a change of heart. And maybe it will lead to some form of reconciliation between you. And so for the sake of making peace, you're obligated to first go to the enemy before you go to the friend. And going back to this idea that in order for society to function properly, there has to be mutual respect, mutual care, mutual trust, mutual love amongst people. And therefore, forgiveness, and this is the time of year that we think about atoning for our mistakes between man and God, and also between man and fellow man. And anytime you can have harmony and peace and reconciliation amongst people where there was prior rift and hard feelings, that's a special mitzvah. And therefore, you choose to help the enemy counterintuitively, even before you help the friend. Now we go into a completely different mitzvah, because I said there are 74 mitzvahs, so obviously we have a big range. And here we're in chapter 22, verse 6. And here we have a number of commandments in this week's parsha of a similar theme. And the theme is compassion for animals. You know, we say in the Ashrei prayer, which comes from King David, V'rachamav al kol ma'asav. God's mercy extends to all of his creations. God's mercy is not only for human beings. God's mercy is for all of his creatures, all of his creations. And of course, that includes animals. Now, morally, of course, the life of a human is more valuable than the life of an animal. Dennis Prager always talks about the fact that when he goes to college campuses, sometimes he asks the students, if you were at the beach with your dog, your beloved dog that you had for, I don't know, many, many years, who's a family member, you know, and the dog is, there's a tidal wave and the dog is drowning. But there's also a human being that you don't know, some stranger, who's also drowning. Who would you save first? Would you try to save your dog, your beloved pet dog, or would you save the stranger? And he said he's shocked that the majority of college students, when asked honestly, say, I would save the dog first. I would save my pet dog first. Now that's immoral, because as much as you love the dog and as much as God's mercy extends to all of his creatures, a human life, which is an image of God, takes precedent over, obviously, an animal, even if that's where justice comes in before love. You may love your dog more than that stranger, but you still have to save the stranger. But here's an example of God's mercy. And even though it is actually controversial, because there's some opinions that say it's not about divine mercy, it's just a law that you have to obey. But there are many laws in this week's parsha that are in a similar vein, and that is compassion for animals. So here the Torah says you're going on the road, you see a nest with birds, and there's a mother bird and there's young chicks, or eggs, not even chicks, just eggs. She's sitting on her eggs, and you want to take the eggs. Says the Torah, first send away the mother bird, so the mother doesn't see the way you're taking away her baby eggs, her chicks. Don't be cruel to the mother. Now I see a question, do animals have souls like us? Clearly they have a living soul. You know, within soul there's many levels. There's 5 levels to the soul, if you want to be accurate. 3 of them come into the body. There's Chaya Yechida, which remain in heaven, connected like remote control. But you have to learn Kabbalah to know more about that. And then there's Neshama, Ruach, and Nefesh. And we can't get into a lengthy discussion. We say someone has a Neshama, that's the spiritual life force, the godly life force that's in the image of God. But the lowest point is Nefesh. Nefesh is just like the animation soul, the soul that allows the body to function and live and breathe. And so, does it have a nefesh, a living soul that allows it to be alive? Clearly, that's why it's alive. But does it have a neshama, which is like a godly soul in the image of God, a part of God in that sense? No. But nonetheless, it has feelings. An animal has feelings. And therefore, you cannot be, we're not talking about physical abuse to the animal here. We're not talking about beating an animal or being cruel to an animal. That goes without saying. Physical abuse of an animal is forbidden. But even emotional and psychological abuse to the animal by taking away its children in its presence, that is forbidden. Now, if you go just a few verses later, verse 10 of chapter 22 says, you should not plow your field with an ox and a donkey together. Now, what's wrong with doing it with an ox and a donkey? So the simple reason, there's many interpretations, obviously, but the simple meaning is that the power of the ox is much greater than the power of the donkey. And for the donkey to be strapped alongside the ox and have to keep up with the weight and the power of the ox is being cruel to the donkey. So do not plow with the ox and the donkey together. Once again, sensitivity here to the physical plight of the donkey. Now, you could take this and multiply it when it comes to human beings. The Torah says not to be cruel to animals. Surely you shouldn't be cruel to human beings who do have a godly soul, who do have a higher level of their Homo sapiens, they have intelligence, they have much higher consciousness and awareness. So if you should worry about the feelings of a bird, surely you should worry about the feelings of a human being. If you shouldn't pair a donkey and an ox together because it's not fair, how many times in life do we expect one child to be like another child? Well, your brother did this, why can't you do that? Maybe your brother has more strengths than you have. And expecting the same thing from both children is being unfair to that child. It's like pairing the donkey with weaker strengths with the ox. Same thing could happen in an office employment, expecting two employees to work together when they're not suited for each other. One's an ox, one's a donkey. Maybe they have different temperaments, So being sensitive to everyone's condition and plight is very important. And there are many other examples throughout the Torah. We know there is a prohibition of tsar ba'al chayim, not to cause pain, anguish, suffering, trauma to an animal. It's one of the 7 Noahide laws, a very fundamental principle in Judaism, compassion for all of Hashem's creatures. And it's illustrated in a number of commandments in this week's parsha. Like I said, there's so much to talk about, but we can't talk about everything, so we're going to choose something else to talk about. And that is a very striking commandment. And again, everything in the Torah is relevant and practical, so we could apply this to our lives in a very practical way. The Torah talks about how to treat an Egyptian and an Edomite. Now, Egyptians, we know who they are. Egyptians, they enslaved us in Egypt. And Adomi is Edom. Edom is the descendants of Esav. Esav was the twin brother of Jacob. And we all know the conflict that began and continues till today between Jacob, the Jewish people, Israel, the children of Israel, which is Jacob, and the descendants of Esav, which represents the nations of the world, Rome specifically, but then all of the nations. So here's what the Torah says. Torah says that Lo tita'ev Mitzri, you should not afflict, you should not oppress an Egyptian or an Edomite. Why should you not oppress an Egyptian, says the Torah? Because you were strangers in their land. Yes, they oppressed you, they threw your babies in the Nile, they enslaved you for hundreds of years, they killed, drowned all the babies. But before that happened, you were visitors, you were guests in their country. when Joseph came, they welcomed him, and then they invited the entire family, and they gave them a place to live in Egypt and hospitality. And because they saved you in the time of famine, because Jacob and his family had to come to Egypt in order to survive the famine, you cannot forget the initial kindness they did with you, even though subsequently they did terrible things to you. But because of that initial kindness, you must never oppress an Egyptian. Now, if you want to see the verse, it's chapter 23, verse 8. Lo tita'ev adomi, do not oppress an Edomite, ki achichu, he's your brother. Jacob's brother is Esau. Lo tita'ev mitzri, do not oppress an Egyptian because you were strangers in their land. They welcomed you when you were strangers. Amazing, right? You have to be kind to an Edomite because he's your brother. The brother of Jacob is Esau. You have to be kind to an Egyptian because you were once strangers in their land. Now, what's the practical application of this? There's no more Edomites or Egyptians. Today's Egyptians are not the old Egyptians anymore. But what the practical application of this is that sometimes a person was good to you, but then something happened and they were not good to you. And they clearly were not good to you. They did something bad. They did something even evil or wicked, like the Egyptians. They persecuted you. The question then becomes, this person was good for me for 10 years, 20 years, and then something bad happened. They did something terrible. So now, do I still have a debt of gratitude to them for the good times? Now, a very practical application of this is parents and children. Many times I meet children, they say, oh, I don't talk to my mother. I don't talk to my father. When I ask them why, they tell me some terrible thing their mother or father did. And then the question is, okay, when did that happen? Oh, when you were 45 years old. So for the past 20 years, I haven't spoken to my mother or father. Okay, but for the first 45 years of your life, your father and mother were very good to you. They took care of you. They gave birth to you. They raised you. They fed you. They provided your education. They did a million things for you. So does the bad thing that let's say your parents really, sometimes it's not even that they did anything bad. It's your projection or whatever. But let's say your parents turned on you and did something really bad to you, whatever that is, God forbid. Or your brother, or your friend, it doesn't matter. But what about all the good years? Does that get all canceled out because of the bad that they then subsequently did? And here the Torah is saying, no, it doesn't. The Egyptians did horrible things to us. There's no discussion. We have a Seder night where we talk about everything they did to us. Right? They enslaved us, they beat us, they persecuted us hundreds of years. Wait a minute. Well, let's remember the good times. When Jacob and his family needed food, they came to Egypt, and Egypt, Pharaoh took good care of them and provided for them and gave them the best territory within Egypt to live and prosper as a family. If not for that, who knows what would have happened? Maybe Jacob and his family would have died from famine. So where's the gratitude for the good? So the Torah says, forever and ever, for all of eternity, you must be kind to an Egyptian. You cannot oppress an Egyptian. Now, this is a little hard to swallow, you could say, but this is what the Torah says. And the same thing goes with the Edomites. On the one hand, the rabbis say, we talk about anti-Semitism. What's going on with anti-Semitism? When's it going to come to an end? And the rabbi says it's not coming to an end. You know why? Because halacha hi b'yadua she'esav soneh leYaakov. It's a fact of life. Esav hates Jacob. He always did, always will. The descendants of Esav those anti-Semites will always hate Jews. But what the Torah is saying is just because they hate you doesn't mean you have to hate them back. Lo tita'ev adomi. Don't hate an Edomite. But they hate me. They're anti-Semites. And it's a very deep idea, and there's a lot of discussions about this. But the Torah is basically saying is you don't fight hate with hate. You have to fight the hatred. You have to obliterate the hatred. You have to obliterate and remove sin, but don't hate the sinner, hate the sin. In other words, a lot of times, I'll just give you a practical example. You meet Holocaust survivors. who experienced the worst evil and horrors known to mankind, their own family members murdered before their eyes. And you say to them, do you hate the Germans? Now, of course, there's a separate discussion on today's Germans responsible for their grandparents' deeds, and that's another whole discussion that actually comes up in this week's Torah portion as well, but we don't have enough time to discuss that. But a lot of the Holocaust survivors says, no, I don't hate. Because if I hate them, then I have become like them. If we still hate Egyptians, then we may have left Egypt physically, but we're still slaves in Egypt. We're slaves to our hatred, to our anger. Of course, we have to fight evil. But it's like the old thing, holding a grudge is like drinking poison and expecting your enemy to die. When you drink poison, you only kill yourself. You don't kill your enemy. And therefore, Judaism is very aware of evil in the world and very much recognizes that there is hatred in the world towards us. But just like you don't banish darkness with more darkness, you don't banish hatred with more hatred. And I know it's a difficult subject, but perhaps this idea, when we go out the night of Passover Seder, we open the door for Elijah the prophet, we say a prayer, Shavo Chamas, pour out your wrath upon the nations of the world. Sounds like we're very vengeful and hateful. But the answer is no. It doesn't say we're angry. It says, God, you pour out your wrath. Meaning, I don't want to be consumed with hate and wrath. I want to be a healthy, happy human being. Therefore, I turn it over to you, God. You're the master of the world. Exact justice. Punish the wicked. Give them and trust in God that there's a God in the world. Now, of course, Simon Wiesenthal traveled the world to find Nazis and bring them to justice. There's a difference between bringing people to justice and I'm not saying, oh, we love everyone. Love your enemy, turn the other cheek. No, that's Christianity. That's not Judaism. Judaism believes that evil people have to be punished. They have to be brought to trial. They have to be sometimes even capital punishment. If somebody kills, according to the Torah, they should be put to death. But don't do it with hatred. Do it out of a sense of justice, because just for the practical reason, if you carry hatred towards the Egyptians and you carry hatred towards the Edomites, then you will be living a compromised life. You will suffer as well. And perhaps when you look at the story of the Jewish people, how we've overcome, not just physically, but emotionally and psychologically, how did we overcome so much persecution? And today we hear so much talk about victimhood, right? Cultures and societies that live with a perpetual sense of woe unto me, what has been done to me. There's so much anger towards others because of what has been done to my ancestors. And Jews never took that route. We always moved on, so to speak. Of course, we remember the past and we deal with it, but we don't carry the anger and the hatred of the past. We try to build new lives and happy lives and not carry that anger and frustration. And, many of you maybe had experience, two of my grandparents survived Auschwitz, my mother's parents. And I have one memory of my grandmother telling me a little snippet about a death march that she went on. But generally speaking, parents and grandparents never told their kids about the Holocaust. Later, Steven Spielberg came along and started doing documentaries, and people opened up with their stories. But for many years, people didn't even want to talk about it. The Eichmann trials brought a lot to the forefront, which was justice. But parents and grandparents didn't want to burden their children and grandchildren with the past. They wanted their children to start new lives, happy lives. And they didn't want to pass on intergenerational hatred or anger or bitterness or pain or whatever it is. So it's a fine line, but the Torah is very clear here. Do not hate the Egyptian. Do not hate the Edomite. The Edomite is your brother. The Egyptian was your host when you came to the country. Try to see the good even in the Egyptian. And it's a fascinating law, but once again, like every law in the Torah, very applicable to our lives, that we should never carry hatred. Sometimes we have to deal with situations. We have to exact justice, even sometimes consequences for people's actions, but never do it out of hatred. And just on a very, very practical level, the Talmud says, Jewish law says, that you're never allowed to get angry at your child. I'll say that again. Jewish law says you're never allowed to lose your temper and get angry with your child. And Jewish law says you're allowed to sometimes act as though you're upset to get the message across to the child. Child does something dangerous, something bad. You could show anger to maybe emphasize the severity of what they've done, but you have to be calm within yourself. You can't be carrying resentment or anger or hatred towards the person. And the Talmud says, if you are feeling internally angry or hateful, you're not allowed to rebuke the child. You have to be coming from a place of love. Now, sometimes that love is manifested with kindness, sometimes with discipline, but it has to be from a place of love. So as much as humanly possible, Judaism doesn't want us to hate. And that's why, I'm not saying we should forgive. Sometimes you see the other extreme. You see Holocaust survivors say, I forgive the Nazis. That's not Jewish either. No one, it's not only not morally correct to forgive the Nazis, but you don't even have the power to forgive the Nazis, because the only one who could forgive them is the 6 million or the other millions that they murdered. The victims, if someone steals from you, you could forgive them, but you can't forgive someone for doing something to someone else. So it doesn't say you should forgive. That's a Christian idea again. Oh, forgive the evildoers. We don't forgive. We believe in justice. We don't love the enemy. Doesn't say love the Egyptian. Doesn't say love the Edomite, but it says don't hate him. Because if you go into a state of hatred, then you're destroying yourself. Or as Rabbi Abraham Tversky once said, holding a grudge against someone else, which is a form of hatred, is letting your enemy live in your head rent-free. And he said, I'm not such a nice guy to let my enemy live in my head rent-free. So the Torah very much warns us not to become an angry, hateful, vengeful people. And I think this is one of the reasons we as Jewish people miraculously, the fact that we survive physically is obviously a miracle. We're a tiny percent and all these mighty nations try to destroy us. But how we remain emotionally and psychologically sane and healthy, you would think that we would be a nation full of anger and hatred and frustration and, angry at the world. Jews are the kindest, most humanitarian people in the world, very compassionate, very loving. How does a nation that experienced so much abuse, and you have a child, God forbid, right, who grew up tragically with a lot of abuse, verbal abuse, physical abuse, that child usually is very, very scarred for the rest of their life because they internalize so much hatred, so much anger, so much meanness, cruelty, abuse. As a nation, we experience so much venom, so much venomous hatred of the nations of the world. And very recently, the Holocaust was just, a few mortgages ago, as they say. Why is that when you meet Jews, even Holocaust survivors, mostly Holocaust survivors, some of the Holocaust survivors, my Bubby and Zaidi, my Zaidi, Allah Shalom, he's the kindest, sweetest person. How did a person who suffered so much, who lost brothers and sisters, he was married, he had a wife, he had children, how does he even function, let alone be a loving, kind person? And I think a lot of it comes back to this week's Torah portion. We say, God, you exact justice on these people. You, Hashem, shefil chamascha, pour out your wrath. I don't want to be a wrathful person. I don't want to be a vengeful person. I don't want to walk around with anger. I give it over to you, Hashem. I know you will give, bring about justice and give them what, deal with them as is deserving to them. Because you believe in a higher power, you could trust Hashem and you don't have to be the one to carry that hatred. So like I said, there's 74 commandments. We may have covered a half a dozen. So there's a lot more to learn this week. So hopefully you'll continue studying the Parsha and go to Shul on Shabbos. And we look forward to seeing everybody soon. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful day.